Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. This is Joe, the bearded historian. He'll tell you an interesting story. Be careful of his soldiers, they can be brats. This is Angel, she's an entity. She'll cause chaos and plant her hands at you. This is Sue, she likes spirits, not the alcohol. She's the reason this channel exists. This is David, he likes fire trucks. He's here occasionally. Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. We preserve his story.
Alright, it's Wednesday. It's late, but not super late, so I think I can get this up before I crash for the day. Yeah, it's 9 p.m. Central? I think it's Central Time. Anyway, today's video is about a rocket ship. So we're going to do rocket ships for a race. Are you ready? Here we go. Shout out time. Here's a shout out just for you. You support me, so I'll support you. This shout out is for our friends. Okay. Yaja, there's Lunch. There's Andy. There's Consciousness. There's Great Lakes. There's Optibob. There's Bell. There's Delta. There's Day 1. There's Ryan, Aisha, Sandra, Scott, Maya, Tech Dig. There's Cal, Jerry, Craze. There's Tay Weezing, Retirement, Phoenix, E-Money, Rushmore, Scully, Andy, Handicapped, Ninja, E-Money. This is E-Money. Music, which I'm going to check and see if I have you on TikTok and Instagram. I'm not sure I do. Let's first of all comment on that one. Come on. Come on. There it goes. Sometimes. Catching up. Okay. Alright, so he's got regular videos. He's also got some shorts. So check him out. Also on Instagram and TikTok. Which, dude, you need to do links. This is silly. Anyway, I'll see if I can find you. Like, share, comment, and enjoy the history of a error ending. No. Alright, pals, you're not going to believe this, but the bearded historian says he found some stuff that he didn't even know. I don't believe him. Vote below, do you believe him? Because I'll believe him.
Yeah, show of hands.
Of course, it's spacey stuff, so I guess it's a possibility you missed it. You're focusing on other things.
On other things, you know. So anyway, those of you who want to take a nap, just go ahead and turn on your recorders and just listen to me ramble. But today's date, as a calendar posted, was July 21st, 2011, was an interesting date in American history because it was the last landing of our shuttle program. The Atlantis made its final flight and came back to Earth on the 21st of July. But the thing I was digging around with that's kind of interesting is, you know, there were a total of 6 shuttles that they built. We lost 2 of them, one during launch and one during re-entry. But it turns out that this design plan that they had been tinkering with dates all the way back to our lovely folks, the Germans, who in the late 1930s had launched a project called America Bomber. It was a project, and the idea by Eugene Sanger, together with mathematician Irene Brett, was a winged rocket They called their version the Silbervogel, or Silverbird. And then in the 1950s, our United States Air Force proposed using a reusable piloted glider to perform military operations such as reconnaissance, satellite attack, and air-to-ground weapons employment. Well, in the late 50s, the Air Force began developing a partially reusable thing called the X-20, or Dinosaur. Yes, that's exactly how it sounds. Now, the Air Force would collaborate with NASA on the Dinosaur and began training 6 pilots in June of 1961. The rising cost of development and prioritization of Project Gemini led to the cancellation of the Dinosaur program in 1963. In addition, the Air Force was conducting studies in 1957 to test the feasibility of reusable boosters. This became the basis for the aerospace plane, a fully reusable spacecraft that was never developed beyond the initial design phase in 1962-63. Now, the two things to remember off of this whole fun scenario that they were working with. First of all, we were in a space race with the Russians, the Soviets. And when we were originally dealing with the whole architecture design and the idea of putting a man into space and safely returning him to Earth, the Russians had quite a problem pulling off the second half of that mission. But the other aspect that they were working with is trying to see exactly how useful some of these aircraft could be. The Americans had a couple different ways of doing this. One was with NASA experiments. Several times they would actually launch their astronauts on top of missiles, like the Mercury and the Gemini probes, both of those. And what was kind of interesting is that some of those shots, they didn't even make it a full rotation around the Earth. They basically got them into the altitude, and then before they made it all the way around, they re-entered and usually splashed down in the Pacific Ocean. Now, at the same time, as we were building bigger and bigger rockets and trying to come up with ways to go faster, we had one group of guys in the military that were very, very smart for what they did. And we also had what was known as the Skunk Works. Skunk Works was a beautiful group. And it's like if anything could go faster or better or more technologically sound, these were the guys that were doing the projects, doing the hard work. For most of you who think of Skunk Works, you might think of the very first spy jet that we had. And the U-2, the V-2 was a nice spy plane, but the SR-71 was just such a leap forward. I mean, here was an aircraft that already looked like it was from another planet. If you went through the unclassified document side of things, here was a plane that had specialized fuel. It had a specialized surface skin. It had specific engines. There were only certain places where this thing would be allowed to land so that they could work on it. And it was such a fast plane that this thing could be in another country by the time the opposing country lost a missile at it. Just, phew, we're out of here, Granted, there was a small problem with the fact that every flight cost about $1 million worth of money to burn through, but, still, fast plane. Now, on the other aspect that they were working with, when you talked about the original NASA astronauts, and you talked about the Air Force that were dealing with making these better aircraft, one of the other happy little ones that they had was this. Basically, they joked but they weren't really lying. There was the X-15. The X-15 basically was, well, you're sitting your butt on a missile. And you didn't take off from the ground. You were strapped onto a B-52 and flown into the air and then released. And the goal was to fire that engine, very big engine, up to just the edge of space, to that happy little void where basically the blue sky is fading out and you're seeing stars. You are that high up. And granted, the flights were, at most 30, 45 seconds. But they were learning stuff that they would later on need for some of these other experimental flights. Now, NASA pulled off probably one of the greatest turnarounds when it came to the exploration of space. Because first of all, they had several people that were actually pulled out of the military to participate in the NASA program. Pilots, skilled engineers. They had scientists that were working throughout the 60s trying to get everything to work because they all wanted to be part of JFK's goal, which was to set foot on the moon before the end of the decade. And what got crazy is that even after they had a horrible disaster with one of the Apollo tests, they had a fire happen inside one of the landing modules and killed three of the astronauts. But they said, if we don't keep going, we're never going to get this to work. And they learned from those mistakes and they worked it on. But as they were working through this process, some of the people started coming across the idea that we have to find a way to do this both cheaper and, if possible, some way to basically make it so the equipment can be reusable. Well, the big reasoning behind this was the original Saturn V rockets that we have all grew up knowing about. Seeing them take people to the moon. They landed several times. The flat earthers don't want to admit anything. But by the time the end of the Apollo missions came, you looked at one of these Apollo rockets, the Saturn V's, and a good 85 to 90% of them was wasted because it was either all rockets and propellant, and all you would have that would be useful in the end was you had the lunar module and the command module, and those are up in like stage 4. And so while you had this great big rocket that was just absolutely huge, just this way little tiny bit way up at the top, that would be all that would be left. The components would either fall into the Atlantic Ocean because they were being launched over in Florida off of Cape Canaveral, Cape Kennedy. Or sometimes, they might be able to find some of the components and bring them back and try to recycle them. But finally what they came up with, off of the historic side of things, they started developing a project considering lifting bodies that would use it so that the aircraft could actually be navigated back into Earth's atmosphere and reused. Now, in 1966, the Apollo program, nearing its design completion, NASA and the Air Force were releasing a joint study concluding that a new vehicle was required to satisfy their respective future demands, a partially reusable system that could be cost-effective. The head of the NASA Office of Manned Spaceflight, George Mueller announced the plan for a reusable shuttle on August the 10th, 1968. Now, NASA issued a request for proposal for designs of an integral launch and reentry vehicle on October the 30th, 1968. Rather than award a contract based on the initial proposals, NASA announced a phased approach for a space shuttle contract and development. Phase A was a request for studies completed by competing aerospace companies. Phase B was a competition between two contractors for a specific contract. Phase C involved designing the details of spacecraft components, and Phase D was the production of the spacecraft itself.
Interesting.
Yeah. In December of '68, NASA created a space shuttle task group to determine the optimal design for a reusable spacecraft and issued study contracts to General Dynamics, Lockheed, McDonnell Douglas, and North American Rockwell. In '69, in July, the Space Shuttle Task Group issued a report that determined the shuttle would support a short-duration crewed missions and a space station, as well as the capabilities to launch, service, and retrieve satellites. The report also created three classes of future reusable shuttles. The Class 1 would have a reusable orbiter mounted on expendable rockets. Class 2 would use multiple expendable rocket engines and a single propellant tank, stage and a half. And Class 3 have both the reusable orbiter and reusable boosters. On '69 in September, the Space Task Group, under the leadership of U.S. Vice President Spiro Agnew, issued a report calling for the development of a space shuttle to bring people and cargo to low Earth orbit, as well as a space tug for transfers between orbits and the moon, and a reusable nuclear upper stage for deep space travel. Nuclear in space, that just seems like such a bad idea.
No, why would that be a bad idea?
Everybody in the ship is going, everybody in the ship is going.
Well, they need to be able to see in the dark.
Exactly. No need for extra light bulbs either.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, after the release of the Space Shuttle Task Group report, many aerospace engineers favored the Class 3 fully reusable design because of the perceived savings in hardware costs. A NASA engineer who worked on the design, the Mercury capsule, patented the design for a two-stage, fully recoverable system with a straight-winged orbiter mounted on a larger straight-winged booster. The Air Force Flight Dynamics Laboratory argued the straight-wing design would not be able to withstand the high thermal and aerodynamic stresses during re-entry and would not provide the required cost range capability. Additionally, the Air Force required that a larger payload capacity than this engineer's design allowed. In January of 1971, NASA and the Air Force leadership decided that a reusable delta wing orbiter mounted on an expendable propellant tank would be the optimal design for the space shuttle. After they established the need for the reusable heavy-lift spacecraft, NASA and the Air Force determined the design requirements for their respective services. The Air Force expected to use the space shuttle to launch large satellites and required it to be capable of lifting 65,000 pounds to an eastward LEO, or lifting 40,000 pounds into a polar orbit. The space shuttle designs also required the space shuttle to have a payload bay of 15 by 60 feet. NASA evaluated the F-1 and J-2 engines from the Saturn rocket and determined that they were inefficient for the requirements of the space shuttle. In July of 1971, it issued a contract to Rocketdyne to begin development on the RS-25 engines. Well, NASA received 29 potential designs for the space shuttle and determined that a design with two side boosters would be used, and the booster should be reusable to reduce costs. NASA and the Air Force elected to use solid propellant boosters because of the lower cost and ease of refurbishing them for reuse after they landed in the ocean. In January of 72, Richard Nixon, the president at that time, approved the shuttle, and NASA decided on its final design in March. The development of some of the Space Shuttle main engines remained in the responsibility of Rocketdyne, and the contract was issued in 71 in July, and updated SSME specifications were submitted to Rocketdyne that April. That following August, NASA awarded a contract to build the orbiter to North American Rockwell, which had constructed the full-scale mock-up later named Inspiration. In August of 73, NASA awarded the external tank contract to Martin Marietta, and in November, the solid rocket booster contract to Morton Thicketall. On July 4th, 1974, Rockwell began construction on the first orbiter, the OV-101, dubbed Constitution, later to be renamed Enterprise. Enterprise was designed as a test vehicle and did not include engines or heat shielding. Construction was completed on September 17, 1976, and the Enterprise was moved to the Edwards Air Force Base to begin testing. Rockwell constructed the main propulsion test article, which was the structural truss mounted on the ET with the 3 RS-25 engines attached. It was tested at the National Space Technology Laboratory to ensure that the engines could safely run through the launch profile. Rockwell conducted mechanical and thermal stress tests on the structural test article 099 to determine the effects of aerodynamic and thermal stresses during launch and re-entry. The beginning of the development of the RS-25 Space Shuttle main engine was delayed for 9 months while Pratt & Whitney challenged the contract that had been issued to Rocketdyne. The first engine was completed in March of 1975 after issues with developing the first throttable, reusable engine. During engine testing, the RS-25 experienced multiple nozzle failures as well as broken turbine blades. Despite the problems during testing, NASA ordered 9 of the RS-25 engines needed for its 3 orbiters under construction in May of 1978. While NASA experienced significant delays in the development of the Space Shuttle's thermal protection system, previous NASA spacecraft had used ablative heat shields, but those could not be reused. NASA chose to use ceramic tiles for thermal protection, as the shuttle could be constructed of lightweight aluminum, and the tiles could be individually replaced as needed. Construction on Columbia began on March 27, 1975, and it was delivered to the Kennedy Space Center on March 25, 1979, so a little less than 4 years. At the time of its arrival at Kennedy Space Center, Columbia still had 6,000 of its 30,000 tiles remained to be installed. However, many of the tiles that had originally been installed had to be replaced, requiring 2 years of installation before Columbia could fly. On January the 5th, 1979, NASA commissioned a second orbiter. Later that month, Rockwell began converting the STA-099 to OV-099, later named Challenger. On January the 29th, 1979, NASA ordered 2 additional orbiters, the OV-103 and the OV-104, which were named Discovery and Atlantis. Construction of OV-105, later named Endeavour, began in February of 1982, but NASA decided to limit the Space Shuttle fleet to 4 orbiters in 1983. After the loss of Challenger, NASA resumed production of Endeavour in September of 1987. Now, after it arrived at Edwards, the Enterprise underwent flight testing of the crew shuttle carrier aircraft, a Boeing 747 that had been modified to carry the orbiter, and in February of 1977, the Enterprise began the approach and landing tests and underwent captive flights where it remained attached to the shuttle carrier aircraft for the duration of the flight. On August 12, 1977, Enterprise conducted its first glide test, where it detached from the shuttle carrier aircraft and landed at Ellsworth Air Force Base. Edwards Air Force Base. After 4 additional flights, the Enterprise was moved to the Marshall Space Flight Center on March 13, 1978. The Enterprise underwent shake tests at the mated vertical ground vibration test, where it was attached to an external tank and solid rocket boosters and underwent vibrations to simulate the stresses of a launch. In April of 1979, the Enterprise was later taken to the Kennedy Space Center, where it was attached to external tank and solid rocket boosters and moved to Launch Pad 39. Once installed at the launch pad, the space shuttle was used to verify the proper positioning of the launch complex hardware. Enterprise was taken back to California in 79 and later served as the development of the SLC-6 at Vandenberg in 1984. On November 24, 1980, Columbia was mated to its external tank and solid rocket boosters, and it was moved to Launch Pad 39 on December the 29th. The first space shuttle mission, STS-1, would be the first time NASA performed a crewed first flight of a spacecraft. On April 12, 1981, the Space Shuttle launched for the first time and was piloted by John Young and Robert Crippen. During the 2-day mission, Young and Crippen tested equipment on board the shuttle and found several of the ceramic tiles had fallen off the top side of the Columbia. NASA coordinated with the Air Force to use satellites to image the underside of the shuttle and determined that there was no damage. Columbia re-entered the atmosphere and landed at Edwards 2 days later. Now, NASA conducted 3 additional test flights with the Columbia in 81 and 82, and on July 4th, 1982, STS-4, flown by Ken Mattingly and Harry Hartsfield, landed on a concrete runway at Edwards Air Force Base. President Ronald Reagan and his wife Nancy met the crew and delivered a speech, and after STS-4, NASA declared the Space Transportation System operational. Now, from what and all I was reading about our shuttle systems, we had a total of 133 successful flights for these shuttles. Again, their main idea was to have a system that we could launch like a rocket, re-enter, glide it, land it like a plane, and reuse it. And for a good portion of it, these problems, the couple times they ran into problems, the first one, most of us who are over the age of 50, hi people, that remember the first problem that they had was that they tried to do a launch in Florida when it was too cold.
Oops.
And what wound up happening is that one of the O-rings in one of the boosters had frozen. And when they had launched it, it started getting up into the altitude. And what happened is that ring caught and it just flamed up. It blew up the rocket engine. It blew up the big fuel tank. The shuttle fell into the ocean. All the astronauts died. The other one that was really crazy, and to this day, they're still having a time trying to get the definitive, because before the second shuttle was lost, they lost the Challenger. The Columbia, a lot of people were saying that this never should have happened, because what wound up happening is that they launched the previous shuttle, and they were already getting reports of pieces of debris would fall off the rocket, when it was launched. It would bounce along the underside, causing damage. And when you think about getting hit with a piece of foam, it doesn't really, comprehend how dangerous that could be. I mean, to me, getting hit by foam is like, okay. Well, the problem is that grid of those tiles underneath the shuttle was so critical to dispersing and protecting the crew from the heat. When Columbia started its reentry quadrant, when you read about what was going on, it had to have been a horrifying situation, because once they started reentering, there was no suddenly, oh, let's fly back up to the space station. No, you're basically plugged in to re-enter. There is no turning around. And those brave souls learned their fate the hard way when their ship was scattered all across the south of the United States. That would be a horrifying situation for those families.
Mm-hmm.
But after that had happened, they, the people at NASA had to sit there and go, well, if we can't do this safely and for the cost, it's probably about time to retire the space shuttles.
Right.
And so, after the shuttles went offline, like I said, the Atlantis was the last one that went up. We started borrowing, of all things, we got lifts from the Russians to take payloads up to the space station. And, people also would pay a few $1 million, rich people.
What?
To go fly in space and visit the space station themselves. But, this was the last flight that we had, was the STS-135. And if I remember right, I think two of them are now, I think one of them is in the Smithsonian. And I think they have a second one that is in there's a big museum down in either Texas or Alabama.
Possibly.
But that would be such a fun thing to go walk around and see.
It would be interesting.
Yeah. But this has been the Bearded Historian playing nostalgia, and you might see me next week, otherwise
How
you may
dare.
throw me out in the garden again.
How dare.
We don't even have a garden.
I'll find a garden to throw you in.
Oh, cool. Okay. Bye-bye, folks.
Let's see. Oh, man, you should have gone one more minute.
Like 29 minutes?
Yes.
Okay.